We're in Joshua chapter 12. I don't know if there are too many sermons on Joshua chapter 12, and I'll tell you why. Okay, here's the first verse of Joshua chapter 12. Now these are the kings of the land whom the people of Israel defeated and took possession of their land beyond the Jordan toward the sunrise, from the valley of Arnon to Mount Hermon, with all the Arabah eastward. Okay, so if you're just joining us, we've been going through this book of Joshua, and it's a story of God's people taking a land that God had promised them generations ago, and we've been using it as a way to reflect on our own journey, and this idea that, yes, we have this destination, we have this goal here on earth, but ultimately we have a goal to be with God in heaven. And so what can we see from their journey that is reflected in our own journey? And the reason why there's probably not a lot of sermons on Joshua chapter 12 is because after verse 1, the entire chapter just lists 33 kings that were defeated. So literally, if I sat here and read to you, we would just be going over each one of these kings that Moses defeated on the east of the Jordan before they crossed over, and then the rest that Joshua defeated as he went throughout the promised land. Okay, so pretty dry. But I want to take a look at this from a couple of angles, because I think this chapter is very problematic if you're a Christian. And the reason it's problematic is if you think about what actually happened, the way it looks, at least, is that there was this land, and within this land, there are these people that were living in the land, and then all of a sudden, this foreign nation comes and invades their land and just starts wiping out people after people, nation after nation. If that were happening today, if we heard that there's this country going around conquering other lands that is not theirs as we perceive it, there would be entire groups of nations that would form together and try to defeat that nation. I mean, I remember I grew up during the first Gulf War where Iraq invaded this tiny country of Kuwait. And all of a sudden, everyone is like, wait, that's not right. And they all banded together to defeat Iraq, right? I mean, there's a whole political issue with oil and stuff like that. But it is very problematic. So how do we as Christians deal with this situation where God told his people to come into the land and basically destroy all the people that were just happily living there, right? So what do we do with that, okay? A couple of things to keep in mind as we explore this. We have to be very careful in placing our 21st century understanding into this context, okay? There's a term called chronological arrogance. In other words, there's this idea that because we exist later than this event in history, then we have a better understanding of what's right, and we have a more a right to judge what should have happened and what should be done, right? There's a lot of culture that we probably don't understand too well. Okay, there's a lot of things going on that if we place our understanding of what's right today to this, it's actually going to cause issues, right? I remember in 1988, the Olympics were held in Seoul, Korea. Okay, and one of the things that American celebrities found out about Korea is that on the menu in restaurants, anyone know? Is dogs, right? So Korean people, they eat dogs. And all these American celebrities were thinking, oh my goodness, they're eating pets, or they're eating Fifi, or whatever, right? They're going to eat my poodle. And they started protesting against South Korea. And they asked people to not support the Olympics. But what these celebrities who were well-intentioned did not understand is there is a whole history behind why, as a nation, Korean people eat dogs. And typically, it's actually, they don't eat pets, okay? There's a distinguishing between just like dogs that are raised for this versus pets, okay? And I mean, come on, the Western world, we eat cows, which is really insulting to other people. So what I'm trying to say is, just like they tried to impose their understanding of culture into a culture they don't understand, we have to avoid that a little bit when looking at this passage, okay? There's a lot of reasons that I cannot get into as to why God told them to completely destroy all the people in that land. I'm not here to defend God because, frankly, I mean, he doesn't need my defense. But I'm here to help us understand that when we read this list and when we read what happened in the Promised Land, we're looking at the end of a much bigger story. And if we can understand the whole story, then maybe to us it'll make a lot more sense what God is doing in this. Okay, are we there? Are we okay? Notice I'm in a stool. So this will be more teaching than preaching today. Right? They say teaching is telling it and preaching is yelling it. So I will not be yelling. So where did this story come from, and why did Israel go into the land? Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 4 to 5 says this. This is God telling Israel, before they go into the promised land, do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out, meaning the people in the land before you, it is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. Whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. Not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going in to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is driving them out from before you. Okay, this is very important. And that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Okay, so what God is telling Israel is, when you go into this land, you're going to win. But you're not going to win because you're good. Okay? So what we see here is, it's not that God is bringing these people in to take over a land that they had no right to because God was on their side. I mean, that's part of it. But another part of it, as much as it's kind of uncomfortable to come to grips with, is this is about God actually judging the people that were in the land. Now that still seems harsh, okay? But again, context, big picture. So we have to actually go back further and ask ourselves, can we put the verse up again, Gwen? In verse 4, it says that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So to understand why God is actually judging the people, we have to understand what is this word. And to understand what is this word, we have to go back to Genesis chapter 15. Genesis chapter 15, verse 12 says this, as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abraham, and behold, a dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. So let me set up the stage here a little bit. This is right after God had made a promise to Abraham that I will multiply your descendants, you will be blessed, people will be blessed through you. And immediately after they make this, in the Old Testament called a covenant or a promise, Abraham goes to sleep. Verse 13, then the Lord said to Abraham, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Okay, this is a remarkable passage, because here's why. Abraham is in the promised land already, and God tells him, but here's what's going to happen. What's actually going to happen is, even though I'm going to give you a lot of descendants, your descendants are going to be servants for 400 years in another nation. What nation is God talking about? Egypt, right? So God is letting Abraham know before it happens, here's what's going to happen. Your descendants are actually going to serve in Egypt, but I will bring judgment on that nation. In other words, God is going to judge Egypt, and they're going to come out with these possessions, right? And then you're going to enter the promised land after 400 years, and the reason why God waited 400 years is because at the end of 400 years, or 4 generations, that's when the iniquity, or the NIV says the sin of these people, the Amorites, which are the people that were in the promised land in the book of Joshua, and the NIV actually says that's when it reaches its fullness. So only after 400 years will the sin of the people living in the promised land be so full that I'm going to bring judgment and I'm going to bring you into the promised land. That's pretty remarkable, right? That God knows ahead of time. But what I want to argue, or what I want you to think about, what I want to maybe let God speak to you about is, even though this seems harsh, that actually one way to understand the events is this is a picture of God's mercy. Psalm 103 verse 8 says this, "The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love." So to us, when we see the end of the story, all these kings are just annihilated, that we're just living in this land. We see it as kind of harsh and judgmental. But really, it's actually showing God's mercy, and here's why. Keep in mind that God waited 400 years before he did this. In other words, he gave them 400 years to change. And if you actually look, let's go to the next slide. If you look at some of the names of the cities that were conquered, okay? One of the kings was the king of Jerusalem. If you look back in Genesis, Jerusalem was where we meet this character named Melchizedek. Okay, Melchizedek was literally the king of Jerusalem, which could be translated as the king of peace or also the king of righteousness. Right? And actually, some scholars think that Melchizedek was the first priest that really introduced Abraham in some way to God. We don't know how he got there, but when Abraham goes through Jerusalem, he meets this priest of God. Okay, so he was both a priest and a king. Something there, okay? The king of Bethel, okay, Bethel actually means house of God. Anytime you see El, that's part of God's first name, like Elohim, right? So Bethel means house of God. Kadesh actually means holy place. Okay? So what am I saying here? Even though this land was full of people that were sinning to the point that God had to judge them, it wasn't like they didn't have an opportunity or a heritage of knowing God. Okay? There was always something there, or there was a history there where there was a chance, and maybe even in the past there was the culture of them following God, but what had happened over the course of 400 years is they started to live in a way that made God have to judge them and made God have to send in his people to basically destroy them because of their sin. Okay? So there was opportunity there. Are we there? I think I yelled. Okay. Now, I don't have a verse for this, but in Leviticus 18, I got to get up, okay? In Leviticus 18, this is a very problematic passage because in Leviticus 18, God gives Israel all these prohibitions, like you can't do this, you can't do that, and it's very strange. And so we struggle a lot as Christians with what do we do with Leviticus 18? Because Leviticus 18 is so specific to some very strange things. Does it apply today or not? Let me just give you a couple of things. Okay, so in Leviticus 18, God tells his people that you're not to participate in idolatry. Okay, that's pretty fine. Okay, that makes sense. Idolatry is bad. Then he spends 12 verses telling Israel not to basically have sexual relations with your relatives. So there are 12, I kid you not, I read this yesterday. There are 12 verses about don't sleep with your father's wife. Don't sleep with your cousin. Don't sleep with, and it's just, God's saying don't have sexual relations with your relatives. Okay, that's kind of weird. And then he goes on and he talks about don't participate in ritual homosexuality. Okay, I'm not getting into the whole homosexual debate, but the context of that verse, okay, is basically God is telling his people that these are the things that are happening in this land. And I'm bringing you into this land so that you will be set apart and people will see you and realize that there's a God out there that they should follow. Okay? So I'm going to bring you into this land, not just so you could have land, but that so people would look upon you, see the favor I have on you, and understand their God is great and I better follow them. But in order for you to stand out, you have to not do the things that they are doing. And so what was happening there is there was a lot of incest. There was a lot of ritual homosexuality because they believed that it would give them power, right? So the issue is these people think the power comes from that, okay? But I want them to know the power comes from me. There was also, we talked about a couple months ago, child sacrifice. They would take their infants and they would sacrifice them to this god Molech by burning their infants. Okay? And there was all these other things that seem so obscure until we understand that what God is doing in Leviticus 18 is he's telling his people, this is what's happening in this land that is just an abomination to me. And in order for you to be set apart, in order for you to look different, in order for you to have a witness, you cannot do these things. Are we there? Okay, nod or something. Okay, right? And so I was reading this book of this guy who smuggled Bibles into these dangerous areas. And when he first got saved, he was praying, God, send me to the mission field. And God said, okay, you want to go to the mission field? Then get a job at the chocolate factory in your town. And he's like, what? Why would I go work at the chocolate factory? I want to go on the mission field. But he obeyed. And what started happening is the people in this chocolate factory were living in such an opposite sinful way that when he came in, they noticed, hey, there's something different. This guy is not like us. He's not living like us. He doesn't talk like us. He doesn't stress about the things we stress about. There's something different in him. And so little by little, people in the factory started getting saved. Why? Because he lived in a way that was so radically different that people had to start wondering, hey, what does he have that we don't have? Okay, and so it's the same thing. God is telling Israel, you got to be set apart. So don't have sexual relations with your family members. Don't sacrifice your children to this God, right? Don't worship idols. Now, we live in a world where we have this thing called moral relativism. In other words, we say, I'm not going to judge what you do. Okay, what you want to do is your business. What I want to do is my business. Who am I to tell you to live this way? But I think we could all agree, as much as there's cultural interpretation, that some of these things, child sacrifice, that's just offensive. Okay, that's just offensive to God, right? And so what's happening, and the reason why God is judging them after 400 years is because for 400 years, they've had a chance to change. But for 400 years, they've been sacrificing their children. They've been living in a way that God did not intend for them. They're not listening to their Creator as to the best way to live. If you want to know what you're designed for, and if you want to know the best way to live your life, wouldn't you go to the person who created you? If you want to be a power user of your iPhone, if you want to know like every capability your iPhone has so that you are the most effective, efficient, amazing iPhone user so that you could use it to change the world, you would ask the person who designed the phone. And what they would tell you would be probably proper information at how to get the most use out of your iPhone. In the same way, God, for generations, has been letting people know, this is how you are to live. I made you. I created you. I know the optimal way that you should live. And yet, for 400 years, they didn't follow. But what I want us to just understand is, even though they had been rebelling, this list that we see is still such a great picture of God's mercy. Right, because he still waited for 400 years before acting. And we see God's mercy in the New Testament as well, in the story of Judas. I'm going to spend a few moments just talking about Judas. It's kind of weird to talk about Judas in this context. But let me give you a little background if you don't know. So Jesus had 12 disciples who were following him as he was teaching and healing. And Judas was the treasurer in the group of 12. So most likely, he was the most educated, okay? He probably had the most education. They viewed him as a very smart and responsible person, and so they trusted him with the money, right? Who are you going to trust with your money? someone who you know has some education in it, or my son. Okay? It's just that sort of situation. But Judas was actually taking money, okay, from the account. He was stealing money. So if you remember, there was an incident where Mary was anointing Jesus' feet with perfume, and then Judas speaks up, and the disciples speak up, and they're like, this is such a waste. Why did Judas speak up? Not because he felt it was a waste, but because he wanted some of the profits from that. Okay? I mean, he was stealing money. And ultimately, Judas goes down in history as the one who did what? Betrayed Jesus. He basically sold Jesus out and led directly or indirectly to Jesus being crucified. But what I want us to see is, even though Judas is portrayed as this evil man, like, how much worse could you get than being the guy who led to the murder of God? The relationship between Jesus and Judas still reflects God's mercy, and that he is slow to anger. John chapter 6. So Jesus gives this challenging message, and it's so challenging that people are like, I don't want to hear it, and they leave. They basically say, Jesus, I don't want to follow you anymore. And here's what Jesus says in verse 66. After many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him, so Jesus said to the 12, do you want to go away as well? Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. Jesus answered them, did I not choose you, the 12, and yet one of you is a devil? Verse 71, he spoke of Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, for he, one of the 12, was going to betray him. Now this sounds a little bit like Jesus is accusing Judas, and maybe he is. He's saying, one of you is going to betray me. But what some scholars think, and I kind of agree with this is actually Jesus giving Judas a chance to change. Okay? In other words, he knows, he's God. He knows that this guy is stealing. He knows that this guy is going to betray him. He knows this guy is a big sinner, but yet, what does Jesus do? Instead of throwing him out, instead of saying, you can no longer follow me, if you read what actually happens, Jesus actually draws Judas closer, and he keeps the sinner close to him. And he gives him chance after chance to change. Okay? If you don't believe me, John chapter 13, this is the Passover meal. After saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. One of his disciples whom Jesus loved was reclining at the table at Jesus' side. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, it is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it. Okay, so who's going to betray you? Well, let me tell you. The person that I give this bread to is the person that's going to betray me. Okay, verse 27. Then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. Is that right? Yeah. And Jesus said to him, what you are going to do, do it quickly. How obvious is this, right? The person who's going to betray me is the person I'm going to give this bread to. And he takes the bread and he gives it to Judas, right? And basically he's identifying, Judas, I know what you're going to do. But another way to view this is Jesus is giving him a chance, because the moment Judas takes that piece of bread and he is identified as the sinner, he has a choice at that moment to say, will I choose differently, or will I go ahead and do what I plan to do? Jesus could have done any number of things. He could have said, he's the guy, get him. And again, or he could have just had him sent away so that Judas has no longer influence. But Jesus keeps the sinner near and gives him a chance to repent. And look how, can we put it up? The disciples so thick, right? So dense. Next slide. Okay, in verse 28, here's what it says. Now, no one at the table knew why he said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the money bag, Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. I mean, come on. The person that's going to betray me is the guy I'm going to give this to. Here you go. And the disciples are like, oh, okay. He just wants Judas to buy stuff. Okay? But Judas knew. He was a smart man. He had to have made that connection. Right? Jesus was reaching out and giving this sinner a choice to change the darkness in his heart. Luke chapter 22. This is when Jesus is finally taken. While he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. So Judas is bringing the soldiers and the priests to come and arrest Jesus. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? So Judas has a signal to tell the soldiers and the chief priests, this is Jesus. Why he has a signal? Maybe they don't know exactly who Jesus is, and so he needs to let them know, this is Jesus. Also, this happened at night, so some people think, well, it's dark. It's really hard to tell. Like, oh, they all got beards, and they're all wearing, like, robes. I can't tell. Okay, so maybe it was dark, so he had to give some signal. And Judas is about to commit one of the most atrocious acts in history, selling out God. And Jesus still, up until the very last minute, talks to him and gives him a chance. Because Jesus asked him, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? In other words, you still have time and you still have a choice to turn around. Up until the last moment, God pursued the sinner. And the entire Bible, if you read Old Testament, New Testament, is this story of a God who is chasing after a rebellious people. If you read the book of Hosea, it's about a people who time and time again prostitute themselves away from this loving God who is trying to tell us and show us the way we should live that would give us the most joy. And time again, God is chasing after a people who prostitute themselves to other gods. Right? To the sinner who is about to lead to his murder, instead of pushing him away, he draws him closer. That is the kind of God we serve. To the sinner, he's saying to us, I know what you did. I'm God. I know what you do in those times when you think nobody is looking. I know the thoughts you think. I know the plans you have that are not my plans. I know. But still, I give you a chance to change. Still, I draw you near. Still, I reach out to you. So as much as we see that list, can we put the list up again? 33 nations, millions of people wiped out as a sign of just God's judgment. If we understand the full story, that they had chances, that God had given them 400 years, and God had sent an army to come in to show them, hey, we're on the wrong side. They still didn't change up until the last minute, except for one. What was the one nation? Gibeon. Right? God just delayed. But it tells us here in Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever one sows, that he will reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but to the one who sows to the Spirit will reap from the Spirit eternal life. So in other words, there's another side of this coin. One side is, yes, God is merciful. God waited 4 generations to give people a chance, even up till the end. But if a people are unwilling to change, there are consequences. Right? Choices do have consequences. And Gibeon was the only one of those nations that escaped because Gibeon saw something, right? Some people would argue that Gibeon saw this army that had defeated Jericho and Ai, and there was probably a little bit of fear. And so maybe Gibeon said, okay, we're going to follow this God because we're scared. But remember, Gibeon was a powerful nation. And less powerful nations still refused to change, even though they saw this God that was wiping out walls and other countries and other nations so easily. Gibeon saw something. Gibeon understood that the way we're living is not working. And it's not very difficult to see that the way we do things is not working. I read a news article earlier this week that said the divorce rate in Taiwan went down this year. I was like, yes, that's progress. I read on. The divorce rate in Taiwan went down 0.8%. So what that comes down to is every day, instead of 157 people, every day, 157 couples divorcing, it's 156. Yikes. I mean, I look at that and I see so clearly the way the world is trying to live this life is not working. The way we're trying to do things is not working. And we have a God who's been pretty merciful. And we have a God who allows us to make mistakes. But we also have a God that at some point is really asking us as people, those things that you know are not good, that I know are not good because I know exactly what you do, are you willing to change that? Or are we going to be people that up until the very last minute are going to fight for our rights to live the way we want to live? Instead of a people who understand that this God who's been so patient with us is inviting us to live a life that is so much better than the life that we've been living. Let me be very clear as we close here, right? Following God's commands cannot save us. Let's be very clear about that, okay? Because we saw, right, God had to punish sin, and he punished sin by himself being the one that got punished for all the messed up things that we do or that the people on that list have done. Right? Obeying the commandments of God cannot save us, but now what it is it's not about salvation. It's about relationship. Because the things that God tells us to do is God trying to draw people closer to him and to live a life that's so much more fulfilling. It's the instructions from the designer of life. And we, at some point, have to come to grips with those areas in our life that we are maybe not willing to give up. We have to decide, are we going to change? Are we going to obey God's ways? This patient, loving God who has been chasing after sinners for generation, and no matter how far we feel, has been chasing after us.